Hello, my name's Dr. Stephen Davidson. I am an ST6 in forensic psychiatry, currently working in NHS Lanarkshire, and I am also the Chief Registrar for Psychiatry in NHS Lanarkshire. Thank you very much for inviting me along to complete this presentation for Lanarkshire Quality Week. This is obviously a pre-recorded talk, so I'll just go towards sharing my slides and we can get started. So my talk surprisingly speaks about the Chief Registrar role, so evolving the Chief Registrar role in psychiatry. So just a little bit about me. So I completed my undergraduate medical degree at the University of Aberdeen, completing that in 2013, and taking up foundation training thereafter in NHS Grampian, working for a year in Aberdeen and then the other year in Murray. I then went directly into core psychiatry training for 3 years in the north of Scotland. I stuck around in Murray for 2 of those years and also did a year in NHS Highland. Thereafter, I came down to the big bad world of the Central Belt and took up a higher forensic psychiatry training post in the west of Scotland. Now, some of the maths will look a bit odd here for 3 years worth of training, but that is because those placements included a few split post placements. But overall, in the 3 years, I've done 18 months with NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde across medium and low security, 6 months in high security at the State Hospital, 16 months so far with NHS Lanarkshire, 10 months with the Priory Group in the private facility Air Clinic, and also I'm away to start 2 months at the beginning of June with the Mental Welfare Commission for Scotland. And if all goes well, I will have my CCT on the 3rd of August 2021. So in terms of my kind of general leadership and management experience before taking on the Chief Registrar post, that started way back in CT1, where I was involved with rota management. I then diversified into committee representation and sat on the psychiatry training committee for the north of Scotland. Thereafter, I was also involved with the University of Aberdeen as an OSCE examiner and as a career mentor. Perhaps some of the main highlights were toward the end of my core psychiatry training. I was appointed a Quality Improvement Trainee Associate with NHS Education for Scotland, and that was working with the NES Quality Management and Quality Improvement Framework. It allowed me to develop an insight into the world of educational governance with postgraduate medical training, and it included also my first introduction really to NHS Lanarkshire, although I'll come on to that later. I was also involved in the Scottish Patient Safety Programme with NHS Highland, and that included a large piece of work that related to improving efficiency with admission pathways to inpatient mental health services, using the Highland quality approach, not hugely dissimilar to what we're trying to achieve with the Lanarkshire quality approach. Then as a higher trainee in forensic psychiatry in the west of Scotland, I did the usual NES Leadership and Management Programme course and had the opportunity to directly learn from aside management mentors. So that included the General Manager and the Clinical Director for Greater Glasgow and Clyde's Forensic Directorate for Mental Health and Learning Disability. I provided higher trainee representation for relevant committees in Greater Glasgow and Clyde, had responsibility for the rota for the court diversion scheme in the same health board, and also continued to be an OSCE examiner at this time for the University of Glasgow. So as I've alluded to before, I only spent a very finite amount of time in the large centres, including a year in Aberdeen and 18 months in Glasgow, when you consider the full 8 years of medical training. I found that outside of the large centres, I witnessed less turgid systems and processes. I felt that services were perhaps more community facing and more responsive to the needs of their population. And I also think you get a much better training experience because you probably work more directly with senior medical staff, which I think is a huge benefit. As I also alluded to in my next role, I was aware of NHS Lanarkshire just very briefly. And I guess towards the earlier part of the last decade, I did notice that NHS Lanarkshire were experiencing significant challenges with regards to postgraduate medical training from what was coming through in the Scotland Deanery. So I was assigned to emergency medicine, anaesthetics and eye intensive care grouping for that role. And I noted that NHS Lanarkshire were getting pink and red flags in the National Training Survey and the Scottish Training Survey data. But later on, we're able to get green flags and suggesting that there had been some positive change within the service. I didn't specifically attend any visits to NHS Lanarkshire, so I wasn't specifically aware of what was contributing to these positive changes at the time, but I certainly clocked this and it made me curious. Within NHS Lanarkshire, forensic mental health services have a very strong reputation, including kind of with the wider forensic estate. Very early on, when I commenced my higher training in the west of Scotland, I was quite keen to engineer a placement to NHS Lanarkshire with my educational supervisor. And we also had two presentations across my ST4 and ST5 years that really just solidified that decision without going into the full ins and outs. One of those talks was by my contemporary Dr. Matthew Morrison, who was the Chief Registrar for the 2018-2019 academic year, talking about the Chief Registrar role. And secondly, a talk by Dr. Adam Daly, the Associate Medical Director for Mental Health and Learning Disability Services, who talked to us about the medical manager role. That just really solidified my reasonings for going to NHS Lanarkshire and applying for the Chief Registrar post within psychiatry. So just to give a bit of background to the Chief Registrar role, it has been established in NHS Lanarkshire for the acute site since August 2015. So this is now year 6 of the iteration of the Chief Registrar wider role. Within psychiatry, we adopted it from August 2018. So as I've said before, Matt was the first. He was an ST4 in general adult psychiatry at the time. And then Dr. Neera Gajri, who was an ST6 in general adult psychiatry at the time, was the Chief Registrar for the 2019-2020 academic years. There was probably quite a sharp contrast between Matt and Neera in their Chief Registrar roles. Matt was, of course, the first to experience the role. He perhaps had a greater interest in medical management and was at the beginning of his training. While Neera had worked in NHS Lanarkshire before as a teaching fellow, she had some of the benefits of what worked well and what worked less well from Matt's stint to kind of adapt the role. She, again, had perhaps a greater interest in teaching and training and was obviously at the end of her training. The Chief Registrar role within psychiatry is coined as a peer leadership role to proactively engage with doctors in training, lead on safety and quality improvement, and advise medical management and training leads on issues related to postgraduate medical training and work with the relevant stakeholders to resolve the same. So in addition to the points raised on this slide, the Chief Registrar role links curriculum competencies with specific activities. It includes acting as role models for junior doctor staff to promote a safe and supportive training environment, promote a safe and open reporting culture by engaging and encouraging junior doctor staff to raise any patient safety concerns through their hospital and departmental clinical governance structures, to provide peer leadership for the junior doctors and participate in service development projects that improve training and patient safety, help core trainees chair junior doctor meetings to facilitate engagement in education and training, facilitate training-led work linking into the wider clinical governance group and the significant adverse events review feedback meetings, assist the junior doctors with facilitating engagement with relevant operational issues such as diary management, rota coordinating, trainee representation on committees, being that link person, as I've said, between trainees and the medical management team, and also meeting bi-monthly with educational supervisors to feedback on training issues as they arise and to input into the local teaching programme. So the initial aims for the service for the 2020-2021 role were to understand the impact of COVID-19 on postgraduate psychiatry training and contributing to positive change in work practice. So this would include the provision of remote balance groups and postgraduate internal teaching, junior doctor meetings, supervision of trainees completing assessments using remote methods, be it near me, be it phone consultations, and feeding into service development such as Morse. Engaging with junior doctors and support problem solving with regards to training and service issues, and that's with allowing the trainees to come up with their own solutions that were mutually beneficial both to them but also to the service. And finally, to engage with foundation trainees to improve the Scottish Training Survey, National Training Survey rating specifically for induction and handover. In terms of my initial aims, having taken over the role, the first one was to learn about the role of the medical manager and associated challenge in greater depth than what I'd experienced previously in my training. So when I was assigned management mentorship in Greater Glasgow and Clyde's Forensic Directorate, I was able to attend various meetings, but I wasn't specifically allocated that dedicated one-to-one supervision with a medical manager, which would allow me to develop that broader insight into the world of medical management and the behemoth of the NHS more widely. I'll come on to this further in the next slide. Secondly, I wanted to develop my understanding of NHS Lanarkshire Mental Health and Learning Disability Services clinical governance structure, from clinical effectiveness to risk management to staff management. Ascertain what groups or individuals held the relevant authorities to make change happen, take things forward, and where possible, this would support any of the work streams that I would be involved in the Chief Registrar role itself. And finally, should NHS Lanarkshire be a service that I wish to settle down in as a consultant, spoiler alert, I do, then it would be allow me to forge meaningful links with and longer term working relationships with colleagues in the service, which would make my life of being a consultant much, much easier. So in terms of the one-to-one management supervision, which I mentioned, it was a key opportunity that I wanted to experience in the Chief Registrar role. It involved 1 hour a session per month with Adam Daly as the Associate Medical Director, and the purpose was to support the acquisition of knowledge and skills to perform the Chief Registrar role. Sessions would generally be structured in kind of 4 sections. The first would be a general update and catch up. Secondly, we would look at coming to an agreement of activities that I could participate in the upcoming month. For example, meetings to shadow, and there were a lot of meetings that I had the opportunity to participate in. I guess just to select a few and why I think they were absolutely relevant to not just the Chief Registrar role, but thinking beyond that. I would mention, first of all, mental health drugs and therapeutics. I'd previously been involved in Greater Glasgow and Clyde's equivalent, which is prescribing management group for mental health. And one of the work streams that I was involved in the Chief Registrar role required the key input of D&T. Another one would have been the out of area patient review meeting. That has to be an area of interest for anyone that works in forensic psychiatry within Scotland, as every health board has a series of forensic patients who is very difficult to manage within the service and often have to be managed out of area. So there are significant challenges in being able to successfully repatriate people, very complex individuals, back to their home health boards. And I was able to see what Lanarkshire do to try and make this happen. But also, surprisingly enough, from my ear clinic job, I was able to see from the other side how this is kind of managed in the private sector, where they are one of the receiving services that would look after these individuals. And I was recently involved in attendance at the GP Working Together group. Again, this is perhaps a particular interest of mine from a kind of workstream perspective. My previous work with primary and secondary care at the interface and other health boards. And again, the point I raised earlier about working outside of the large centres and being able to tailor services to serve the population that they are kind of working for, I think is absolutely crucial. And that, I thought that was a very good initiative to see how that takes hold. So there were other meetings that I would attend regularly. In addition to that, it would include the junior doctor, specialty doctor, and liaison interface meeting as the rep for hire trainees, but also the recruitment group meeting. And the latter I consider to be quite an innovative step for NHS Lanarkshire. It was to try and address the well-known and particular workforce challenges that psychiatry faces more widely, but also as a particular challenge within NHS Lanarkshire. So bearing in mind it's a wider issue within the UK, this was maybe perhaps the first time that I'd seen a health board take a proactive step in being able to address the specific challenges for their service. And I thought that was really good. And then finally, focused management discussion, which I'll go into in a bit more detail next. So they were held again as part of the one-to-one supervision sessions and addressed a number of topics to complement my own learning in the role, from organisation of the NHS, the time management, running effective meetings, and the last one that we did was the importance of policy and process. So I've got two more. You'll see that there's 10 bullet points there. Session 1 is really serves as an introductory session, and session 12 is more for a conclusion and evaluation with the AMD. These topics do continue to be tweaked, considering that the Chief Registrar role remains fairly novel. For psychiatry, it's only been in place for the past 3 years, and I'm sure that it will adapt over time to become increasingly efficient to my successors. As someone who doesn't have an additional postgraduate qualification in leadership or management, I found these sessions to be very helpful to reflect on my own practice and also the challenges that I would encounter, not just in the Chief Registrar role, but also with the Chief Registrar role, and thinking about how I take this forward as I progress in my career towards becoming a consultant. So there were several work streams that I was involved in. I was given the opportunity to be involved in 4, and I was happy to be involved in 4, but wouldn't necessarily take the lead for every single one. I agreed to take them all in some capacity, but would delegate certain tasks to other individuals that I thought maybe were better placed to do certain things, perhaps definitely for perhaps number 2, the bullet point, but we'll go through them in time and try and explain what was trying to be achieved. So the first was a focus on induction. This goes back to that aim for the service around the Scottish Training Survey and National Training Survey data. In reality, the educational supervisor leads had done a great job before I'd even started making changes to the induction programme, while also making adaptations to take into account the impact of COVID on induction before I joined the service. So instead, my role would morph into support and improvements related to other training matters, again, strongly influenced by COVID. There were documents outlining the roles of the junior doctor and the duty doctor were quite outdated for the service. Since their creation, there had been significant changes to how services operated and the job plans of other individuals, other health professionals that contribute to emergency and crisis roles, in addition to COVID, which meant that it was absolutely in need of a revamp. A major area to be addressed would also include the idiosyncrasies of where patients tend to fall through the gaps in services. For example, the provision of liaison psychiatry out of hours. Physical health and psychotropic monitoring was a key interest of mine, having covered similar projects with Scottish Patient Safety Programme in NHS Highland, but also within NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde. It was part of my Leadership and Management Programme course and was also involved in a National Prescribing Observatory mental health audit. So within forensic services in Greater Glasgow and Clyde, but also in Lanarkshire, I was pleased to see when I came here that we have the same established processes for supporting psychotropic monitoring. It's helped by having a small caseload and a captive audience in comparison to other areas of mental health, which makes it pretty easy for us, but certainly a much more of a challenge elsewhere. The aim was to have an agreed standard for NHS Lanarkshire's mental health and learning disability service, and in the first instance, pilot this within general inpatient services. And finally, I agreed to take a lead on GreatX. This is an initiative through the Learning for Excellence model to promote recognition and appreciation of achievement and good practice. This was following my experience of seeing this in action both at the State Hospital, but also with Priory Group at Ayr Clinic. The aim was to pilot this within my own service in forensic services and also the AMD service and older adult services to ascertain whether this was worthwhile and a valued scheme. So in terms of activities and achievements that I've been able to be involved in with the Chief Registrar role, firstly, as I had alluded to before, Dr. Reka Hegde and Dr. Andrew Donaldson, who are the training leads for psychiatry in NHS Lanarkshire, had already made significant and fantastic changes to the induction process, including the provision of various online videos that would serve as an introduction to psychiatry and would support a comprehensive induction despite the ongoing pandemic. One of my CT colleagues was, however, able to provide a much needed update to the quick start guides for our acute sites at Hairmyres and Wishaw. I had used my previous knowledge and experience of equivalent junior doctor handbooks in other areas of Scotland from psychiatry, but also in my next role to help support what could also be included during this revamp. On a related matter, I had organised a teaching event for non-psychiatry trainees working in psychiatry in August for the first rotation of the academic year. This provided a series of talks on the most critical of topics to equip junior doctors with the necessary skills and knowledge to work safely and successfully on call. So it would include your real basics of history taking and mental state examination, but also your commonly encountered out of hours queries around alcohol detoxes, delirium, and crisis presentations as examples. These talks have since been provided online from recording of this initial toolkit talks for later rotations of junior doctors, and it's given us the idea of the potential to have further talks and teaching events just to totally bolster that induction programme for Lanarkshire. I helped support changes to the delivery of an internal teaching programme. This included an updated format for journal club presentations, using different breakout rooms just to retain some semblance of interactivity and discussion during the pandemic, which has largely went down reasonably well. I think people would still prefer to meet face to face, but until that day comes, I think it's an adequate substitution. Next, perhaps I was involved in revamping the clinical fellow job adverts, including the job descriptions and essential and desirable criteria to make these job adverts more attractive, but also clearer in what the day-to-day job role would involve, for those appointed to the post, so that they weren't being, I guess, weren't picking up something that was much different from what they were expecting. One of the first tasks I was also involved in was preparing a guidance document for junior doctors in how to conduct remote consultations, whilst also outlining how these can be appropriately supervised as part of a training experience and workplace-based assessment schedule. I also conducted a survey to ascertain some of the barriers in achieving this, which would support management to make the necessary changes so that we can continue to deliver high quality training experience for our junior doctors. I was able to contribute to aspects of quality improvement and audit. For example, I chaired the winter internal teaching event where junior doctors would showcase the audit and QI projects that they had undertaken in front of wider mental health and learning disability services. I attempted to link some of the like-minded projects together, particularly in relation to the components of psychotropic monitoring. And we've been able to start a database for these projects so that subsequent trainees can continue future cycles and improvements for ongoing pieces of work, which has worked quite well in other large specialties such as anaesthetics across Scotland. Finally, I've been able to advance the various work streams, although I'll talk about some of the challenges and limitations in a bit more depth in the next slide. Where we are at present, the role of the junior doctor / duty doctor is drafted and is awaiting comments before final approval, having been updated by one of our experienced CTs that's worked in the service for 3 years, near enough. The psychotropic monitoring is a bit of a minefield because it involves a huge amount of coordination and systems to kind of fall into place. However, at this current time, we now at least have guidance for psychotropic monitoring in NHS Lanarkshire Mental Health and Learning Disability Services. Several smaller projects on aspects related to psychotropic monitoring have been completed. That was what I was talking about with the winter event. And we'll hopefully be able to knit some of these components together with the help of a current short life working group that's examining admission processes for inpatient services. In the future, the hope is that this will filter into the community. As for Greatex, we are currently waiting on IT to put into place the electronic system to pilot the Greatex project. The business proposal and graphics are in place. Pilot sites have been identified and awareness sessions are planned prior to going live. The most obvious challenge for me, first of all, in the Chief Registrar role has been the nature of working a split post. I'm quite used to spinning plates and pride myself on my time management skills, but it has been a particularly challenging with a busy ST6 job, working across 2 services and technically 3 sites when you take into account Bedford Lodge, HMP Shots and Air Clinic. I spend a maximum of 3 days per week in Lanarkshire working within a fairly niche specialty, where I'm not always on the ground at the right place to be that constant, to be that consistent figure, to embed change. And in a way, the change to more remote working has allowed me to be more flexible in how I organise my week and what I'm able to attend, but it's not always entirely positive for forcing through change. And that moves me on to my next point. It wouldn't be a talk in 2020, 2021 if we weren't talking about COVID. It didn't feature heavily in the presentation. The move towards remote working, as I said, has at times been a barrier to developing working relationships with colleagues across mental health and learning disability services. I don't think we can underestimate the value in that face-to-face contact with our colleagues for this reason. For example, the only time that I've actually met face-to-face with my associate medical director, my clinical director, my training leads was at a recruitment event in February 2020, so it feels such a long time ago pre-COVID. And when it comes to affecting change in the wider service, I view it's absolutely necessary for us to have access to those short chats in the with colleagues in the corridor, being able to build that mutual respect and trust for each other, which allows things to happen in that kind of more mutually beneficial way. COVID in itself has also directed us towards more immediate priorities, both for individuals and for the service, which can unfortunately frustrate progression with the work streams that I've discussed previously. For example, to take GREATEX forward, I've had to wait for an IT group to reconvene once services had been remobilised, so that they could approve the implementation of that electronic system that would be required for the project to be helpful. I could have been impatient with this. I could have done it on a paper-based system. However, I would worry that if I rushed this through and did it on a paper-based system, it would entirely devalue the project and there would be poor uptake and engagement. So we decided to postpone at least until we had the infrastructure in place. And again, that kind of brings me on to my final point on challenges. Being between paper and electronic systems, I think this will be a familiar one for people. You'll be aware that the move towards MORS from MIDAS for electronic patient record and the introduction of HETMA for electronic prescribing has been a huge change for NHS Lanarkshire as a health board. And that doesn't include some of the current paper-based or paper-light systems that continue to remain in place across mental health and learning disability services. This is hugely relevant when considering that psychotropic monitoring workstream, where the current system is fragmented, it's cumbersome, it makes it very difficult to maintain high standards in that area. Again, like GREATEX, it would have been daft for me to force this through as an inadequate system just to try and establish some change when the existing and supportive infrastructure was not in place for it to succeed. So what are my reflections on and what are the future for the Chief Registrar role within psychiatry in NHS Lanarkshire? My first point again follows on from the previous slide, and I believe that it reflects the nature of change within the NHS. Dr. Daly famously said to me that change takes a few years to fully embed into practice, and he's certainly not fibbing with that one. Although the alumni of the Chief Registrar role in psychiatry have had very distinct experiences in the role so far, certainly from my experience of implementing change both in and out of the Chief Registrar role, there needs to be a degree of continuity of the various work streams to make sure that the change does embed within the service. So while I have at times been a bit frustrated of what I have and haven't achieved in the role, I will ensure that my successor can continue to take these work streams forward. I have briefly touched on the recruitment challenges faced by psychiatry. While the Royal College and local initiatives have demonstrated some success, we do continue to face a battle for the coming years as we're left with the early retirees from the legacy of mental health officer status leaving the NHS. I believe that the Chief Registrar role should demonstrate the positives of NHS Lanarkshire's mental health and learning disability services, with the aspiration that we retain our psychiatry trainees into their consultant careers. At present, both myself and Nira have taken consultant posts within NHS Lanarkshire, and I suspect that both of our experiences have been a key component in making this decision. And again, this leads on very nicely to whether the Chief Registrar role in future should instead be reserved for ST6s, maybe ST5s. I guess this may be a controversial point, and acute sector may see this differently. There are certainly pros and cons to both approaches. Personally, however, I found that the Chief Registrar role to not necessarily just be a bridge between the consultant group and the trainees, but more of an apprenticeship on steroids for becoming a consultant. Having that specific management mentorship and understanding the inner workings of the NHS and the priorities of the specific service has allowed me to have that shift in mentality from, although I'm still a trainee, I have been able to think like a consultant who strives towards improvement and sustainability within the service, and not just seeing that end date of I'm going to the next placement, so to speak. We should acknowledge that the Chief Registrar scheme in Scotland more widely is a fairly newish development, and we're slowly building a network of other Chief Registrars in other specialties in other parts of Scotland in the meantime. In my role, I've had the opportunity to attend a couple of wider meetings with other Chief Registrars, both in Lanarkshire and within Scotland. My impression, though, is that the specific remit of the Chief Registrar does differ by specialty and region quite significantly, and I suspect that there will be a movement towards having a greater consensus on the Chief Registrar role of what it involves in the near future. Obviously, I've outlined my views on the Chief Registrar role as being a particularly strong stepping stone towards making that consultant transition. However, I do know that colleagues elsewhere very much see the role as more a trainee rep, and I think we'll have to watch this space and see how things take shape over the coming years. And finally, like most other quality improvement and anything I've ever done to bolster the CV, although I'm being flippant here, this has been more than just a CV builder. I think it has been probably one of the best opportunities I've been involved in. The Chief Registrar role probably didn't happen in reality unless I was able to publish on my experience at a conference. So I do intend to submit an abstract for poster presentation before the end of June deadline to develop an excellence in medical education conference later this year. I've got a month to get it sorted, as I've said, and putting everything into this PowerPoint presentation today for this Lanarkshire event has certainly focused my mind on the content of this abstract, so it's been quite helpful. That is the end of my talk. If anyone wants to get in touch at any point, my contact email address is there, and that is my talk. So thank you very much, everyone who has taken the time to listen to this, and I hope you enjoy the rest of Quality Week. Thank you very much.